It looks like a good day to harden off my tomatoes. Or is it? Why is it that something so simple as hardening off plants can be so difficult? Join me today as I discuss hardening off and give you some tips. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is the table where I do most of my hardening off. It's about a week away from my last frost date. This is the time of year that I do most of my hardening off. And the day is overcast, ideal for the first day of hardening off. But I don't know that I'm really going to start hardening off my plants today. You might be able to see that it's a little windy. I have to figure out if it's too windy for the first day of hardening off. There are just so many things to consider. One of the first considerations when hardening off is whether the plant even needs to be hardened off. We operate under the assumption that our tender indoor plants need that gradual exposure to harsher conditions outside. That's why we'll bring them out for a few hours and then take them back in overnight. And then the next day, bring them out for a few more hours and then take them inside again over the course of a week or two. That's what hardening off is all about. But what if your conditions outside are similar to the growing conditions inside? That's what happened with these potato plants. I looked at the forecast last week and realized that my daytime outside temperatures were going to be about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, very close to my indoor temperature. And the nighttime temperatures are actually warm for this time of year, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, suitable for these potatoes. And there was no harsh weather events forecast. So instead of doing my planned hardening off with these potatoes, I just brought them outside. I was expecting that the harsh sun might cause some damage, and sure enough, some of the leaves were sunburned. The plant was big enough, it was healthy enough, it was robust enough that it was able to shirk off that cellular damage and do just fine. And now, a whole week later, the plant's looking wonderful. It was big enough and the temperature was mild enough that it worked without hardening off. The size of the plant is an important factor when deciding whether the plant is ready for hardening off. When it comes to my tomatoes and peppers, I like to have at least about 6 inches of growth. This plant is about as small as I prefer when it comes to hardening off my tomatoes. This one looks like it's more than ready. It's got good height, it looks healthy, and I should be hardening it off soon. But small plants like this shishito pepper are a little too tender. I don't think it could hold up to the harsh sun and the wind and the colder nights that I've been having. Because potatoes can handle some cool conditions. Below 50 degrees at night is just fine, but peppers and tomatoes don't do as well when exposed to those cooler conditions. So I prefer to have my nighttime temperatures consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit when I begin hardening off. That's one reason, a big reason why I decided to get a greenhouse. I'm working to get the nighttime temperatures warmer in this space so that I can harden off those plants like peppers and tomatoes sooner. By putting them in this sheltered environment, particularly at night, I can ensure that those plants aren't exposed to those cold conditions. But of course, there are other factors to consider as well, which is why it's not so simple. I like the daytime temperatures around 70. I like the nighttime temperatures around 50. If I don't have that, I can use my greenhouse to get started a little bit early. But I have to anticipate when the plants are going to go into the ground so that at the completion of hardening off, they can be transplanted. And now the soil temperature becomes an important factor. The soil in this bed is just barely 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That will be okay for cool season plants, but it's not okay for those warm season plants like tomatoes and peppers. Tomatoes should have a soil temperature of at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit at transplanting. Peppers should be at least 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And both will do better if the soil temperature can be closer to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So even though I can begin hardening off now, especially with the aid of my greenhouse, the soil temperature in my beds is not good enough. So it's still not time for me to harden off my peppers and tomatoes. And this creates a hardening off dilemma that shows hardening off is more than just picking a date on the calendar and starting the process. For me, that date is in about a week. My last frost date is a good time to normally start. That allows time for the soil to continue to warm, and then at the end of a week or two with the plants hardened off, I can get them into the ground. But right now, it's still just too cool. It's overcast. We've had rain, which is highly unusual for this time of year, and the soil is just not warming up. And so while a young pepper like this has more time to stay indoors, these taller tomato plants are going to be outgrowing these pots pretty soon. So I may need to consider transplanting these tomatoes into bigger pots. And then I can put those bigger pots into my greenhouse. I've measured the temperature of the soil in my greenhouse and it's already 60 degrees. So that's telling me the nighttime temperatures really are holding well. I may need that spot for storage. If you don't have a greenhouse, that means you've got to figure out more space for your bigger plants under lights. You may need to get bigger pots. You may need to get more lights. That's the dilemma, because you have to ask your question, is it more important to do the hardening off at the right time for the transplanting, or do you accept that the root-bound plants that are kept in the small pots will be hindered in their growth? The size of the container and the size of the plant are also important to take into account when you add the wind factor. For a plant like these tomatoes in these little red solo cups, they're okay. The cup is heavy enough to be able to handle a light breeze. But if these plants start getting much bigger than this one that's approaching about 6 to 8 inches tall, they'll easily blow over in a strong wind. So in this case, I go ahead and put the cups into a cardboard box. The cups help stabilize each other and they're less likely to blow over. Another advantage of the greenhouse is that I can put my solo cups on my bench and not worry about them blowing over at all. At some point, I do want them exposed to some wind before I put them out in the main area of the garden. But for the entire time they're hardening off, they don't need that wind. I've looked at my long-range forecast, and there are no more nighttime temperatures anywhere close to freezing in the weeks ahead. So I can start the hardening off anytime soon. Of course, there are other weather factors to consider besides the temperature. For me, wind really is a big one. So when I come out in the morning, I have to look around and I'll look at my trees and I'll look at the other plants in my garden to see how the wind is affecting those. Because these young tender plants can handle a little bit of wind like I have right now, but they can't handle the harsh conditions like I've had in recent days with 35 and 40 mile an hour winds. That's enough to just snap off some of these plants. And of course, Rain and hail is another important consideration when you're looking at the forecast. Yesterday, we set a record for the amount of rainfall we had in that day, almost 3 inches. It's never happened before in the month of May here in Colorado, and it happened. That rain was hard enough. It would have damaged these plants if I had left them outside. If there's any indication of hail, and of course, with a thunderstorm yesterday afternoon, we had some hail. You can't have your plants out in those conditions. So looking at the temperature, I could probably start hardening off, but with everything else, these plants are going back indoors in just a little bit. Be aware that you may need to be flexible with your hardening off plan. Ideally, every day we're exposing these plants to a little more sunlight. And by day 4 or 5, we're leaving them out overnight to be exposed to the cooler variation that the nighttime temperatures will bring. And after about a week, we can put them out in the garden. But what if a weather event happens that disrupts that plan? What if we get that heavy rain or that hail or that freeze that blows in when we weren't expecting it and it disrupts our schedule? That's okay. You don't have to start the clock over again. All we're trying to do is to get these plants used to conditions that aren't so protected as they are when we're growing inside. So if on day 3 you have to stop the hardening off and move these plants indoors for a day or 2 or 3, the clock doesn't start over again for another 7 days. You may only need another 3 days of hardening off. The plants will speak to you. If they're staying out overnight and doing okay, then you can probably put them into ground without too much concern. And you need to consider the potential for garden pests when you're looking at hardening off your plants. Now, I don't have a problem with slugs or snails. So when I'm talking about the size of plant I like to harden off, I'm looking at what can hold up to the sun and the temperature and the wind and the rain. But I had a conversation with Eli from In the Garden with Eli and Kate. They're concerned about the size of their plants so that they can hold up to the slugs and snails in their garden. If they try to harden off plants that are too small, the slugs will eat them and devastate their entire crop. If you have those kind of problems with garden pests of any type, when you harden off, you may need to take into account the protection from those pests. My greenhouse has given me the flexibility to overcome many of these factors that might be a problem. I can go ahead and do some of the hardening off in the greenhouse. And for these bigger plants, I can go ahead and transplant to a bigger pot and leave this bigger pot in the greenhouse. It's more space for me to use. You might be able to accomplish the same thing with a cold frame or maybe with hoops and plastic. A big consideration, especially when we get back to the idea of temperature, is that the plants shouldn't be exposed to extremely high temperatures. So whether you're using a greenhouse or a cold frame or hoops and plastic, you need to make sure that they have adequate ventilation during the day to stay warm and not hot. I'm out here all the time looking at these plants, making sure they're not overheating. I'm not so worried about the sunburn with these plants because I'm not going to expose them to a full day of sun on the first day like I did with those potatoes. But once they've been exposed to gradually increasing sunlight, my bigger concern is that I don't fry them if the greenhouse gets too hot, or the cold frame, or a hoop and plastic. Hardening off is simple, but it's not necessarily easy. As long as you look at those factors that I've been talking about, you'll figure it out. And your plants will be just fine, and they'll go in the ground, and you'll wonder why you worried about hardening off as much as you did. If you want to learn more about other aspects of gardening that can be helpful for that garden success, look at this video next. I'm Gardener Scott. enjoy gardening.